And there we are. Why, hello, everybody. We are live yet again. And for another Friday live. We missed last week, um, and we are live this week. So I know probably some of you are wondering about the dream show. And why is it only me? Where is my other dream show person? And so I'm sure that'll be a question that we'll address. So my dad is actually, in terms of our Friday lives. Oh, and by the way, welcome to the live stream. And could you take a second and share the video? Give it a like, thumbs up, whatever you have to do. Let people know that we're live. If you share it, it lets people know we're live. So I'm just gonna take a second and share the video. That lets people know we're live. So just bear with me as I do that and share that and share that and share that. Okay. Um, there we go. Good morning, Jim. Good to see you. Yeah. And normally the last Friday of every month, we go live and we do dream interpretation. Many of you have been following us we've been doing that for the last 4 years. And we're not stopping doing that. However, for this particular Friday, which is the last Friday of the month, my dad happens to be on a trip. So he is not here today. So we'll be doing the live dream interpretation show next week. This week, we're continuing on our spiritual living series. If you looked at the description of the video, you would have seen that's what the description says. That we're doing our spiritual living series. So we've been doing that for the last month and a half or so, diving into what constitutes a spiritual life. And it's a topic of interest to me. We've been thinking through these things on the Wind podcast. We've been going through what does it mean to develop in a health, what does spiritual health and maturity look like, which really is a companion piece to these live streams. What does the spiritual life even look like? And so I'd encourage you to take a look at the Wind Ministries podcast. You can just find that on any podcasting platform. My dad and I have been going through, actually, the episode we just posted yesterday is a dive into, great to see you, Lorraine. The episode we just posted to the Wind Ministries podcast yesterday was a dive into the development of the brain and how it goes through 4 main stages of development, reflective of the 4 main portions of the brain, how that and how that aids our spiritual health and growth. And so anyway, we're diving into that, and then on this live stream every Friday, I'm going live talking through what does it mean to live a spiritual life, and how do we define that? And so we've gone through, lots of different things so far. This is our 6th episode, I think, on what comprises a spiritual life. We looked at what does it mean to be human? What is a human being? Is the whole thrust of everything to get back to a pre-fall state in Adam and Eve, um, or do we look at the person of Jesus? Which obviously the answer is the person of Jesus. Jesus is what it means to be fully human and alive. When we see that, we looked at the human project, right? That was another thing. We looked at what are we being saved from? What is sin, and what are we being saved from? What's the makeup of a human? And wrestling with certain ideas that are out there, trying to just come to, not so much come to conclusions, but just explore and think through some of these topics that are heady, that are weighty. And my goal is to not so much, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, my goal is not so much to tell you what to think, but to give you things to think about. and those are very different things. I'm not telling you conclusions. I mean, I may come to conclusions, my own conclusions, but I don't want you to just go, oh, that's how Josh thinks, so I need to think that way. No, I want to give you food for thought that would cause you to contemplate and think through, what does all this mean to me or to you. Um, and so that's the goal. I'm just realizing I have some music playing in the background I need to turn off. So and I'm assuming that the audio is working this time too. I still think I have a bit of trauma and pain from my going live a few weeks ago when my audio wasn't working. So um, yeah, anyway, so today, the topic at hand, as we're working through this, my whole goal with this series on spiritual living really started, actually, you can think about it starting probably 10 plus years ago, when I started thinking through, how can I help people understand, um, how can I help people find, not just understand, but how can I help people find access to the kind of things that um, I wasn't shown growing up in a Christian home, or in a church, the typical church upbringing. Um, because I discovered things like, um, uh, the mystical authors, the desert fathers, patristic theology. This kind of stuff is just really shifted and shaped who I am as a human being and how I live my life. And growing up, this kind of stuff was just non-existent. And so, it's kind of, I like to joke occasionally that in our charismatic Pentecostal circles, if that's your circle anyway, um, that theology and experience and our knowledge of Jesus and all of that started in 1904 at the Azusa Street Revival, right? It's kind of characterized, in my experience, it was characterized as everything else had been lost and it was restored then. And it's not, I don't know that it's so much someone said that particular phrase to me, but it's definitely something you pick up um, in the environment and in the culture. And that's another thing that we could talk about, how culture teaches us who to be. It's a whole different ball game to go through. So we're exploring these things, and I'm trying to help people find, hey, there's a whole vast array of thought process out there. And as I've said, especially in the podcast with Murray, Voices from the Desert, another plug for a podcast you should go check out, our podcast, Voices from the Desert. You can find it on any podcasting platform. Um, as I've said with Murray, my podcasting co-host, that uh, I I'm trying to help people discover what I that trying to help people discover what I wasn't shown, but even more so that in discovering the writings of the Desert Fathers, the Christian contemplative authors, that means the mystics, um, I found a solidarity and went, I think I've experienced that, or I think I've had shades of that, or that makes sense to me. And so I'm hoping that I can present things to you that make sense to you and make sense. Not just, when something makes sense to you, it makes sense of you. And I kind of become more aware of myself and more aware of who God is, to whatever degree we can be aware of who God is. And that's one of the things we'll dive in today. And so what I wanted to talk about today really was just an overview. We've looked at an overview of what it means to be human, the human project, and that's kind of the first phase of this video series, what it means to be human. And so now what I want to start looking at is looking at what is Christian mysticism. What makes, in the context of Christianity, what makes a mystic? Um, and that's, that kind of language is not our everyday language. And it just looking at the particular phrase Christian mysticism, a Christian mystic, requires a little bit of historical background to get, well, what do we mean when we say that? And because sometimes the term mystic takes on, in our present day environment, takes on connotations of someone who has ecstatic experiences, someone whose life is marked by signs and wonders, maybe someone who, the kind of in the charismatic Pentecostal fold, when we look at these people who we would call, quote unquote prophets. I don't necessarily like that terminology, quote unquote prophets, who have mystical experiences, we might say that. And by mystical experience, we mean, well, they go to heaven, they see things, they have visions. I remember having in a private meeting. Those of I've been connected with Streams Ministries and John Paul Jackson. Those of you that don't know who that is, that's fine. A prophetic figure. Yeah, I remember him saying at one point when someone asked him, "What, if anything, what do you regret? What would you do differently?" He was in his 60s when he was asked this question. What would you do differently? He passed away in 2015. What would you do differently? And he said he would talk about his experiences less because people made it all about these experiences that he had. And that, I never forgot that what he regretted was letting people know what he had experienced. And that's an interesting thing. So what happens is we take the experiences of a person and we go, well, that's what makes them a mystic. And so we go, well, these people that talk about the supernatural revelation, the capacity to prophesy, the ability to have supernatural experiences. By the way, the word supernatural just means beyond the ordinary, right? Super, above, supernatural. Anyway, they have non-ordinary experiences, and those are characterized by dreams and visions, strange events, signs and wonders, healings, miracles happening around them. And so that's kind of, I think that's kind of what the term mystic, the connotation with it, the ideas that it's taken on. I remember reading a book, probably maybe 10 years ago, something like maybe more than 10 years ago. Um, it was called The New Mystics, and it was by John Crowder. I don't know John Crowder, and I don't know where he stands today, so I'm not trying to critique John Crowder. I just remember coming across the idea in the book, and essentially what he does in the book is he goes, okay, here are the mystics in Christian history. John of the Cross, Augustine's considered one. Thomas Aquinas would be one. Teresa of Avila, Teilhard de Chardin. I don't know if he puts all of these in there. Uh, uh, John Ruysbroek. There's a Dionysius Areopagite. There's a lot of them, right? So he goes through in the book The New Mystics and shows, well, here's all of the historical mystics, and here's the new mystics. And so he's got Shayon in there, he's got Bob Jones in there, things like that. It is characterized by um, the existence of signs, wonders, and supernatural events. And so this idea that this is what constitutes Christian mysticism is firmly entrenched in the charismatic conscience. Um, yeah, Karen, that was one of my favorite interviews, actually. That interview with Michael Sullivan. Oh man, I love Michael. That was so good. That's on the Voices from the Desert podcast. So great to see you, Karen. Um, so this idea that Christian mysticism is experiencing supernatural events and this isn't an old idea. This idea is kind of entered into the public consciousness of Christianity over the last 100 years. And just suffice it to say that when you look at the history of the term Christian mysticism or mystical theology, that's just not what it means at all, in the least. And so and Joel, let's do this. The term mystical theology, okay, where we get the term mysticism from, was essentially coined by an author in the 5th century fifth or sixth century, fifth century, named Dionysius. People call him Pseudo Dionysius. It's the pen name of the author is Dionysius the Areopagite. The idea is that um, it was written by the Dionysius that Paul engages with in Acts 17 when Paul goes and speaks at the Areopagus, and Dionysius is one of the figures who goes, we would learn more about this. And so the idea is that Dionysius wrote a book called Mystical Theology after having become a Christian, and he was actually a particular teacher in the early church in that area. The school of Alexandria, I think it was Alexandria, was characterized by Dionysius, was one of the guys who was supposedly a main thinker, theologian, teacher in that area. So influential figure. So a book was probably written in the 5th century, not by Dionysius, but someone used the name Dionysius, which was common back then to do that. Dionysius the Areopagite. Because you're saying this is kind of in the vein of his teaching by saying that's one of the hard things about studying ancient texts is figuring out who actually wrote them is not necessarily an easy task. Like that, there's certain this may be controversial for some of you to hear, but it's very true that in the New Testament, there's certain letters that there's a lot of scholars that are convinced Paul didn't write all the letters that we attribute to Paul, because you look at the style of writing, the kind of things he wrote, and things like that. And so there's some question of authorship on those. I tend to think that Paul wrote all the letters that we think Paul wrote, and there's a thought process behind that. But a lot of people think he didn't. So it's hard to attribute authorship to someone. So Dionysius Areopagite wrote, we'll say Pseudo Dionysius wrote a book called Mystical Theology. And that's really where that term starts to crop up, mysticism. Again, we're also talking about things that are translated into English from the Greek and Latin, which were the two main threads of language in the development of Christian theology, were Greek and Latin. And there was a lot of arguments over how to apply different terms because of the different meanings from the different languages and how they translated between one culture to the next and one language to the next, and all fascinating. I find all that stuff fascinating. So Dionysius writes a book called Mystical Theology, coins the term mystical theology, and literally the term mystical theology literally means the knowledge of the mystery of God. So right away, when we talk about mysticism, Christian mysticism, and mystical theology, we should pause on the meaning of that term, mystical theology. Mystical means of or relating to mystery, right? Things that are mysterious and beyond our comprehension. And theology means the knowledge of God, the theory of what God is like, theology. So mystical theology means literally the theory of what the mystery of God is like. So to look at that, first off, Christian mysticism is the exploration of the mystery of God, is not the exploration of signs, wonders, dreams, and visions, things like that, but it is primarily about the knowability of God and the capacity of humanity to know God. This is what classically Christian mysticism is about. And so Veronica, we do have a spiritual coaching, private lessons in that sense, for health, development, growth in your spiritual life, that kind of stuff. I actually will put a link to that up. Give me just a second, because we do offer that. I will bring a link up there for that. And you can get a hold of us and let us know if you're interested. Help you know the Father, develop in your prayer life, understand these things. So, yeah. So there you go. You can take a look there. Anyway, what was I saying? Mystical theology. So, like I said, it's not the capacity to. I think this is this differentiation we need to make. Mystical theology, Christian mysticism, is not the capacity of the human to experience strange things. It's the capacity of the human to know the mystery of God, and it is the mystical journey as it were, is the perception of the mystery of God. That's what we're talking about when we talk about Christian mysticism. That knowing God is a mystery, and here's kind of the thought process behind it. Here, I'm going to read. Oh, maybe I won't read this. It's the thing is when you read Dionysius, it's like it's pretty heady stuff. So let's see. Here, we'll just give you a taste, okay? Dionysius can be a bit difficult to understand. So he says this. All right, so bear with me, and I'll explain it. Deity above all essence, knowledge and goodness, guide of Christians to divine wisdom, direct our path to the ultimate summit of your mystical knowledge, God's mystical knowledge, most incomprehensible, most luminous, and most exalted, where the pure, absolute, and immutable mysteries of theology are veiled in the dazzling obscurity of the secret silence. I love his language. Outshining all brilliance with the intensity of their darkness, and surcharging our blinded intellects with the utterly impalpable and invisible fairness of glories surpassing all beauty. Whoa. What's he saying? He's saying essentially this, that God is beyond all knowability. That he says, right? He says, outshining all brilliance with the intensity of their darkness, his darkness. So darkness meaning the not darkness in the sense of being dark and evil, darkness in the sense of it is beyond light, it is beyond shining, it is beyond brilliance. Darkness, there's a one of the great works of Christian mysticism is called the cloud of unknowing. And the idea of the cloud of unknowing is that you go through this dark cloud to perceive God, that the perception of God is beyond intellect and knowledge and reason and capacity and all of these things. So when he says it's where our intellects are blinded with the beauty of who you are, meaning I can't perceive intellectually and perfectly what you're like. And that's what Dionysius is trying to say, when and he has a couple other works that codify the approach, the divine names and the celestial hierarchies are what he wrote. But in the idea of Christian mysticism is kind of codified by Paul when Paul says things like, that it's the really the competing narrative in Scripture, and Paul says things like he dwells in unapproachable light. Right? Like, okay. Or he hides himself in darkness. Okay. Well, he's unapproachable light, meaning when I look at him, I can't see him. Or he's hidden in clouds of darkness, meaning when I look at him, I can't perceive him. Or no one has ever seen the face of God, right? Paul makes all of these allusions um, to the mystery of who God is. Yet at the same time, Paul localizes the reality of Jesus, thinking of Colossians 1, where he's got the competing narrative of God is knowable, yet God is unknowable in Colossians 1. I've got my Bible right in front of me. So I was just reading this and thinking about this today. And not in preparation for this, actually. I'm just trying to study Colossians. So he talks about, let's see, that first or Colossians 1, here, verse 15. This is talking about Jesus, right? Think about this, right? Think about the tension in this verse, okay? Colossians 1:15. I don't have it up, so I'll just read it. He is the image. This is talking about Jesus. He is Jesus. He's talking about his beloved son. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Okay, so he's the image, right, of the invisible God. That is invisible God means I can't see him, I can't perceive him, I don't know him. He's invisible, but he's the image. So how can you have an image of an invisible thing? Like that makes no sense. If it's invisible, there's no image of it, right? You understand what I'm saying here? So this is the mystery that Paul's trying to contend with. And this is what Paul's saying when he says things like he's dwells in unapproachable light. No one has ever seen him. He's hidden in clouds of darkness. He is invisible, but in Jesus we see the image. And there's this competing tension. Think about it this way, competing tension in all of Scripture over the knowability and unknowability of God. And Scripture is content with letting it be a tension and a mystery. So we look at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, which we already looked at in other ways about the nature of creation. But I want to point something out is that you have pictured in creation the Spirit hovering over creation, the voice of God echoing over the face of the deep, bringing form out of chaos, right? God spoke and it was created. God spoke and it was created. God spoke and it was created. So the Spirit, God's Spirit, hovering over all of creation, right? Ostensibly not just earth, but all of creation, hovering over all of creation. And so this is we would call this the transcendence of God. He's above his creation, giving form and speaking into it. But then we see in Genesis 3, God walks in the garden in the cool of the day. What's that? Right? So his Spirit hovers over all of creation. He forms everything out of chaos and wildness and darkness, brings his power and Spirit to bear over all of creation. Yet then you see him pictured walking in creation, walking in a garden, calling out, physically located, right? So what is that? You've got the tension between the transcendence of God, he's big, he's unknowable, he's bigger than all of this, and then the immanence of God, that he exists within it. And again, Scripture is content with not solving that problem. It's a problem we try and solve, but Scripture is content with not solving it. And it is the unknowability of God. This is what Dionysius calls mystical theology, the knowledge of the mystery of God. God who is unknowable, because in his very essence, how could you possibly know him? The Spirit that hovers above creation, the God that dwells in unapproachable light, that when you look at him, all you see is radiance and brilliance. You can't make form or function. Also has an image. We're called his image, right? He calls us an image, but then he walks in the cool of the day, calling out to Adam and Eve in the garden. So we've got transcendence and immanence. Those are two competing things that don't compute together. Transcendence means not of anything. It's above and beyond anything we can ever possibly um, uh, uh, comprehend. But immanence means he's within and with us. So the thrust of mystical Christianity is not the capacity to have strange events, but rather it is the perception of God given to man to know the unknowable. That's what we mean when we're talking about that. And so what happens and what we get confused by is a lot of the you can call them contemplative authors, because the word mystical has also been translated as contemplative. You can call them they'll say things like they'll talk about the vision of God. And so you'd think, well, you're talking about having a vision, but they're not really talking about having a vision. They're talking about when they say vision, they're talking about the perception. Think vision means eyes of the heart, not the ability to see something. The heart perceives it without seeing it. The heart's aware of the reality of it. And so when the mystics talk about apprehending God, they're not talking about seeing or knowing him in his fullness, but they're talking about, I have been touched by something and I don't know how to communicate that. Here's a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Catholic mystic in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he says this, it's a prayer he gives. He says, Lord, lock me up in the deepest depths of your heart, and then holding me there, burn me, purify me, set me on fire, sublimate me, till I become utterly what you would have me be through the utter annihilation of my ego. This is the apprehension of God, is the transformation of the inner man. It's not that I can say this is what he's like and this is what he's like, or this is what this is what I see when I see him. Another example in Scripture is thinking of Isaiah 6. If you've read my book, Transformation, Catching a Glimpse of the Beauty of God, you'll be familiar with this thought process. which is really that's kind of one of my first forays into trying to explain these kind of things, which you can find on Amazon or on our web store, Transformation: Catching a Glimpse of the Beauty of God. It's right down there in the well, bookshelf. Um, and Isaiah in Isaiah 6 has a vision of God. He says, "I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." Isaiah is totally undone. His everything about him is completely changed. He leaves that experience. He just with a vision for vision in the sense of a passion for taking a message to the people of God. When Isaiah says, "I saw the Lord," he never describes him. He describes everything else. I saw a throne. I saw a robe, the train of it. He talks about the living beasts he saw. He talks about everything, but he never talks about what God looked like. He just talks about the impact it had upon him. And that's what you see, this constant refrain in the mystics is it's not we had a bunch of experiences. In fact, many of them share no experiences whatsoever. Great to see you, Sarah. Better, it's true, better late than never. So just for the record, by the way, interrupting for just a moment. Normally on the last Friday of the month, we would be doing a dream show, and today we are not. We're continuing the spiritual living series, mainly because my dad's a traveling, and he'll be back Saturday or Sunday. I think he's on his way to Nashville right now, or no, Memphis or something like that with his wife Teresa. So we're actually not doing the dream show today, and the dream show will happen next week. Justin, great to see you as well from Orange County. So Christian mysticism, right? Going back to that. It's the apprehension in the heart that when the mystics talk about the vision of God, they mean how my heart has been arrested by him, because it's the eyes of the heart that perceive God, not the eyes of the intellect, not the eyes of the soul, not the physical eyes. It's perceiving God in the depths of your being, and it's beyond it's not sense perception, right? When we think of the five senses, touch, taste, uh, touch, taste, see, smell, and hear. It's not any of those. That's not when they talk about perceiving, they're talking about a perception that goes beyond the natural order, the natural means. And so that, again, the perception of the mystery of God, we're perceiving something. Bernard of Clairvaux, here's another one. Bernard of Clairvaux, he describes it. He says this when he's describing the experience of God, right? He goes, "As a drop of water seems to disappear completely in a big quantity of wine, even assuming the wine's taste and color, just as red molten iron becomes so much like the fire, it seems to lose its primary state. Just as the air on a sunny day seems transformed into sunshine instead of being lit up, so it is necessary for the saints that all human feelings melt in a mysterious way and flow into the will of God." So, three analogies that Bernard uses to describe the mystical experience. Not one of them is an actual vision. It is that there, on some level, I seem to disappear and he seems to appear. Right? Teilhard de Chardin says the same thing when I read that one. The annihilation of my ego happens when I come into contact with him. And not that I lose my sense of personhood, but I actually become more aware of all of creation, and I'm actually my delusions of what life is like completely disintegrate in the face of God. There are moments in my life when I'm touched by the consciousness of his tender affection for me that's beyond words, that's beyond experience, that's beyond the ability to communicate, where I become more aware of what life is like and who I am. And that's something that's difficult to describe. Like, I disappear, but I actually it's like in a way when I experience God in a profound sense, I disappear, but I actually appear. And I'm like I actually who I am appears, but I seem to disappear. I kind of melt and now I see myself, but before I couldn't see myself. This is what, when we talk about the eyes of the heart being enlightened, like Paul prays this in Ephesians 1, this seems to be what he's getting at, is let that you would so disappear that you would actually finally begin to appear. And this is the kind of stuff that Paul talks about in Colossians 1, 2, and 3, that we begin to appear because we've seen him. Right? Let's talk about John in 1 John 3. Beloved, we don't know what we're going to be, but we know that we will be like him. We disappear and then we begin to appear because he's appeared. And something arrests us in our inner man. And it's like, I can't describe what it is. I can't give form or language to it. I can't even give a proper quote unquote theology about it, but I know something's there. And it's like, I like to say this, that prayer is when you become aware that someone else is with you. That's really what prayer is. Prayer is not petition. I mean, there's different forms of prayer, but at its core basis, when you sit in kind of the stunning silence and you become aware slowly that some other personality is there with you. By personality, I just mean there's a being. Again, it's hard to talk about God in terms of his being because he's beyond. I am a being, he is being. Like, that's a totally different classification. So it's difficult to talk about these things. But my delusions fall away, my perception of creation increases. And yeah, Berta, I feel that and my hands get warm. It's true, where there may be a quote unquote sense perception, but the sense perception is not the perception of God, right? We may have a there may be on the journey of it, there may be certain particular physical reactions, um, but it's not a particularly physical thing experiencing God. This kind of quote unquote mystical Christianity. Again, it's not I had a vision or a dream or supernatural things tend to follow me. No, lots of these guys won't. I mean, you read John of the I've got this one here, the essential Saint John of the Cross. Okay, John of the Cross. We're going to talk about all these guys eventually on this series, right? We're going to go through each one of them and dive in deep, and we'll probably have to do multiple episodes on John of the Cross. John of the Cross is called the doctor of mystical theology in the Catholic Church. So he's the guy you weigh everything by for the Catholics. That's what a doctor means. It's like when we want to understand this particular concept, we go to John. And John he's like the de facto expert. And so how do we understand this? So John doesn't talk about experiences at all. You can tell by his writing that he has had experiences, and he even tells his disciples that he's writing to the other members of his monastery that if they give too much credence to the experiences they have, they'll enter into delusion in terms of, well, I saw this and heard this and all that. Because the perception of God in mystical theology is about the mystery, the stripping away of all the senses and the stripping away and the annihilation of the ego, that my delusions disappear and I become more real. And actually, the one of the de facto results of this is a yearning to pray for all of humanity. I'll read you this one. This is a quote from an author named Zacharias. Fairly contemporary. This book was written about maybe 60, 70 years ago. And he's talking about the teachings of his spiritual father, who was an Orthodox monk named Sophronie of Essex. And he says this, um, then slowly, when this healing comes, that's the mystical journey, by the way, is one of healing, the healing deep within. Then slowly, when this healing comes, he receives an inner eye, and with this inner eye, that's the eyes of the heart. With this inner eye, he looks at the world and begins to sigh, saying, and the world is he's not looking outside at the perception of the world. He's looking inside at the world of the world, the kingdom, right? That's the world that he's looking at, right? The eyes of the heart actually look inside, not outside. That's a whole nother topic. So he receives an inner eye, and with this inner eye, he looks at the world and begins to sigh, saying, O Lord, and this world knows thee not. Give this portion of thy grace to every creature, to every man that comes into this life. Then man begins to repent for the whole Adam, meaning all of humanity. And his cry becomes, as Elder Sophrony says, a universal cry. Um, and so the characteristic, one of the characteristics that seems so typical in the contemplative authors, in the mystical authors in Christian history, is just that as the the person caught up in the embrace of God progresses, if you could say it that way, what takes a hold of them and grips them is a conviction that all of humanity needs God. And Sophrony, especially Sophrony, says this is the third stage of the contemplative life, actually, to Sophrony, is that this universal cry for humanity to know God, and this kind of intercessory cry for humanity to know God is the characteristic of the mystical life, and not a kind of a individualistic um, uh, assent of the person to God. But now that I've apprehended God, I actually can't help but cry out that humanity would be saved and would know God. And because in a way, you encounter who you truly are, which is a reflection of Him. And we know Scripture is very clear that His desire is that all of humanity would be saved. Not that all of humanity will be saved because people make their choices, but His desire is that all of humanity would be saved. And so our cry becomes His cry because we become like Him. This is what the mystics are saying. What they're pointing at is, again, it's not the mystical experience is not having an experience, it's the perception of God in the heart. And again, it's a hard thing to talk about, to codify and lay out. Because the mystic might talk about seeing God in the sense that, this he's got an inner eye that's opened and he sees God, but he's not talking about a visible apparition, a vision, a form that's impressed upon the conscious mind. He's not talking about that. The so and that's where we get confused. So Justin asks, would you consider mystical theology charismatic? I'm assuming what you're asking is, would I consider mystical theology charismatic, like the charismatics and the Pentecostals would be the continuation of mystical theology? I think that's what you're asking. Um, I heard it said one time, and I think this is probably an accurate description. Well, for one, it's defining charismatic and Pentecostal is a difficult thing. It's not a simple, well, this is because now we've got so many expressions of um, the what started as the charismatic renewal. And so is there really a charismatic theology? Because the charismatic renewal was typified as the awareness of honestly, okay, well, it's typified as the awareness of the Holy Spirit, the infilling of the Holy Spirit. The Pentecostal is a little bit the same, but also a little bit different because there's particular forms that took as well, and there's a wide body of disagreement over what constitutes um, the Pentecostal fire and what constitutes the charismatic infilling. So it's hard to just say yes to that because there's many in the charismatic who emphasize the kind of visionary experiences that I'm saying don't characterize mystical Christianity. So in the sense that in charismatic circles, the emphasis tends to be on the infilling of the Holy Spirit and the practice of the spiritual gifts. If that's what we're defining as charismatic, then they're definitely not firmly entrenched in mystical theology. Mystical theology is not about that. Those things can happen. I'm not saying they don't, but they're not the core or the experience or what fundamentally makes that up. Um, so and then we have to get into what is prophecy and how do we think of prophecy? What are spiritual gifts? See, the thing is, I will say this, that I do think that the mystics, in the sense of the Christian mystics over history, starting uh, the mystical tradition would point all the way back to Adam being the original mystic. So when we talk about post biblical writings, and we get to the last surviving mystic in the Bible would be John the Beloved, and then we get into the post biblical time and lots of different guys, right? So I would say that the the mystical theology, Christian mysticism, is um, the ongoing the continuation of the Old Testament prophets. I would say that because but then, that requires a little bit of teasing out for you to understand what I mean by that. Because the function of the Old Testament prophets, was not to predict the future or to even prophesy the future. The only reason they prophesied the future, in my estimation, against the Josh's thoughts, right? Again, I'm trying to give you food for thought, not telling you how to think. The reason the prophets prophesied the future is because they were talking about the nature of God, and God was going to come in the future in the form of Jesus. And so you see on every page of the whole Old Testament, but especially the prophetic books, and especially Psalms, which is just about the most prophetic book in the whole Bible. Um, you see on every page this pointing forward to the coming of Christ, because they're talking about the nature of God. Let me read you a quote to give you a thought, because I was actually thinking about this as I was thinking through this. There's a quote from Abraham Heschel, who is a Jewish theologian, and he wrote a book called The Prophets, and he was talking about what made a biblical prophet. And I think this is really, really key, in terms of understanding what I mean when I say the mystics are the continuation of the prophets in Scripture. And he said this: the fundamental experience. This is a bit of a longer quote, so bear with me. The fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos. Pathos means feelings, more than feelings, but pathos means the deep seated emotional experience. So the fundamental experience of the prophet is a fellowship with the feelings of God, a sympathy with the divine pathos, a communion with the divine consciousness, which comes about through the prophet's reflection of or participation in the divine pathos. The typical prophetic state of mind is one of being taken up into the heart of the divine pathos. Sympathy is the prophet's answer to inspiration, the correlative to revelation. Prophetic sympathy is a response to transcendent sensibility. It is not like love, an attraction to the divine being, but the assimilation of the prophet's emotional life to the divine, an assimilation of function, not of being. The emotional experience of the prophet becomes the focal point for the prophet's understanding of God. He lives not only his personal life, but also the life of God. The prophet hears God's voice, and feels his heart. And that's very much, when you look at the mystical authors, what they're trying to point at is that it's not so much they're not the prophets weren't saying that this is what's going to happen in the future, but they were saying this is what God is like. So much of the prophetic books are an a the prophets were trying to get the people of Israel to return back to God. This is what he's like. Come back to him, right? This is what he's like. We've experienced him. Most of the mystics are saying this is what he's like. This is what it's like when I encounter him. Now it's hard to say what he's like, but I can just say he's beautiful, he's good, but I can't tell you how he's beautiful or how he's good. I just know that he is. And this is how it settles deep into who you are. And it's not so much, you know, well, this is how you have an experience. It's, guys, he's worth it. He's good. He's beautiful. But that's all I can say about him. Well, words eventually fall apart trying to describe him. And we're going to talk more about this, because we're going to break down. There's a difference between how the East has approached mysticism and a difference between how the West has approached mysticism in terms of Christianity. And that doesn't mean, I don't mean West in the sense of America and the UK and all of that. Or East as in terms of the Asia and the Middle East and things like that. No, the East and West were a divide between two cities that centralized the teaching on Christianity, Antioch and Alexandria. And that's where the East and West distinction comes from. And that's where you get the Orthodox and the Catholic. And these are very different strains of Christianity. What I'm trying to say is that taking a high level view and looking back down into them, the Catholics and the the Orthodox, the mystics in any particular camp have to largely agree that mysticism is about the perception of God in the heart that's beyond our ability to grasp what he's like. And that is that is really what characterizes all of mystical theology. The school of we can say it this way too. Again, illusions, metaphors, all of this. Mystical theology is the school of knowledge that affirms both the knowability and unknowability of God, because we can't know him because he's beyond, he's transcendent, but we can know him because he's immanent, he's here. It's the reality of the incarnation, and that's why the incarnation is actually so vitally important and such a major part of Christian theology that you can't gloss over that. That God, who by nature of being God is beyond the human's ability to grasp. It's like, think about it this way. I have a chocolate lab. Okay. That chocolate lab has no idea what it's like to be human. No idea. Right. You could talk to him until you're blue in the face, and he will not grasp what it means to be human. He can't grasp what it means to be human. He doesn't have the fundamental requirements of what it means to be human. So that dog will never understand what it means to be human. Never. No matter how much you try, that dog will never understand what it means to be human. That's, in a way, that's what we're saying when we talk about God. I will never understand. Just can't hope to. Now, he can see me, my dog, and he can see what I'm like, and he can learn how to respond to me. And so he can make assumptions about what I'm like, but he doesn't always know what I'm like. And, it's a beyond his ability to grasp, just like it's beyond our ability to grasp what God is like. But I can, but because, it's I didn't think about this analogy before, but I'm liking it. To the dog, I'm transcendent, but I'm also immanent. It's a simple way of trying to explain what I mean by that. To us, God is transcendent. I can't know him. I don't have the capacity to know him because his thoughts are beyond my thoughts. He hovers above all of creation and then forms it. How could I possibly know a being like that? But then he's immanent, and so he is the image of the invisible. Well, he's invisible, but he has an image. Well, how does that work? That's the tension. That's the mystery. Don't try and solve it. Just be content with it. Because if the Bible, like the Western mind wants to solve it, right? But the Bible's content with it being a mystery. How do you talk about Jesus? Well, it took him 450 years to iron out some conceptions and language that would articulate what the Bible teaches in a clear way. And they said, beyond that, we don't know. It's hard to say. So let's just a couple other quotes. Here's Simeon the New Theologian, Orthodox, would be considered an Orthodox mystic. How do I worship you within me? And how do I see you far away? Right? There's the tension right there in his question. How do I worship you within me? And how do I see you far away? How do I observe you in myself? And how do I see you in heaven? You alone know this. You who do these things and shine like the sun in my material heart immaterially. So immaterially, he shines in my heart, but it's my material heart. So he's gone. There's this tension, and I can't solve it. I have to be given to it. It's something that's not explainable. Exactly, Karen. I have to be content with it. So this is the hard thing about talking about these. And when we make assumptions about what the spiritual life is about and what the then flowing from there, what the Christian mystics are about, and go, well, it's about supernatural experiences, or they talk about having visions, and so that must mean that anybody who has visions is a mystic. No, because the vision they talk about is way different than the vision that a contemporary prophetic figure who stands on stage and says, I had a vision of this, is talking about. Very different things. So going back to your question, by the way, I was going to say this. I heard an Orthodox priest say one time, and I'll use this analogy because I think it's appropriate. Thinking about the charismatic Pentecostal moves and the and mystical theology. Do we see the continuation? And he was comparing the charismatic church with the Orthodox church, and I think it's an apt analogy that the mystical theology and the charismatic Pentecostal tradition, they both share the same back alley, but they're not the same thing. So you look over there across the alley and you go, that looks really familiar, but it's not exactly the same thing. And so I just want to make that distinction. So here, lastly, I'm just going to go through what I find to be a some characteristics of, that are broadly sweeping across um, people that we would call Christian mystics, regardless of age, regardless of affiliation, right? East, West, uh, and first century, second century, 20th century. And the here's some characteristics. The first characteristic is they've been gripped by something, and a thing that they can't quite describe, but they can't let go of. So they've been gripped. That's the first characteristic. And that's Simeon's language, right? What he was saying. Like, how do I describe you? I can't. But the thing is, Simeon's trying because he's been gripped. And he's so convinced of it. Actually, one of his arguments in his day against the detractors of their particular practices in the monastery was, you can't describe what you haven't seen, so you have no place to speak here. And so he's trying to describe what he's perceived. Um, so they're gripped by something. Two is they're insanely humble. Like, it's crazy. Um, they are, well, Sarah, yeah, and Justin, like, one of the things if you go back to the beginning of the video, I was talking about, I read Crowder's book years ago on the New Mystics, and I found that it seemed like he was and I don't know John Crowder at all. I just remember reading the book. I don't follow John Crowder, so I don't know where he's at today. In that book, it seemed like he was conflating the two, the charismatic Pentecostal move and the strange events, signs, wonders, visions, and saying, well, they're the new mystics because they're experiencing these things, and the the Christian mystics experience those things. I just don't think that's a true thing to be able to say. So that's one faulty understanding, and I don't know where he's at now on that. So I'm not trying to criticize him. I'm just that book was written like 20 years ago, so um, he probably thinks differently. But I just wrestled with the concept because I went, yeah, just what I've read is not really an accurate depiction. So Sarah said mystics are very focused on theology as well. Kind of, in a way they are, but it's because, like I was saying, with Simeon, he's gripped and he's trying to describe to people what he's been gripped by. So he's not focused on theology in the sense that it's a pursuit of his to understand. Like, I know people that are going, well, I want to be able to, like, I want to be able to give a really good defense of Reformed theology, so I'm going to read Calvin's Institutes. That's not the way that they are, quote unquote, theological, because they're not focused on theology so much as they're focused on explaining what God is like. And anchored is a better word. Yeah, that would be a better word. Very much so anchored in that. And their experience, again, and like, when I say it's like, okay, I'm having an experience live streaming right now, right? I'm having an experience of life presently. I experience my wife, right? When I go home for lunch, which I will do in a few minutes, I experience her, right? So when I say experience, there's so many layers to what I mean by that. And so when I say I've experienced God, do I mean I've experienced God in the same way that I am experiencing life, in the same way that I've experienced my wife, in the same way I experience my kids? No, it's fundamentally different. And so theology based on experience isn't even really the best way of saying that as well. But they've been, again, this is why you struggle with the language. They've been gripped by something, and it is this impetus within them that they can't help but do to try and help people see that. It is, it's, in a way, it's pointing back and saying, here, the path is this way. That's really what it's about. And the path is this way, the path is this way, the path is this way. You guys come this way. And encouraging people what the path looks like. A lot of the teaching, actually, in the mystical tradition is um, how to remove the things that hinder um, the mystical tradition, the mystical encounter. Yeah. Anyway, so again, it's a wrestle. So incredibly humble, um, and they almost seem otherworldly, actually, when you either meet someone who's been caught up like that, or when you start reading about their example, you're going, man, this person seems so different than anyone I've ever met. And I suspect that when we start talking about what happens is most people start envisioning people they've heard speak publicly. Most people that would be characterized as a quote unquote mystic would never take a public platform, especially not as regularly as people do. Um, yeah, Remnant Radio, those are good friends of mine. Josh, we just actually did an interview with Josh, put the first episode out on the Voices from the Desert podcast. I've been on their show many times. The great guys. So they do talk about these things and give some really helpful things. I've been on there talking about the Desert Fathers and contemplative traditions and Dark Night of the Soul and stuff like that. So these people have been gripped by God. They're humble. They seem almost otherworldly. There's something so different about them, and they don't usually demand a platform. They're usually very hidden. What concerns them is not usually what concerns most. It's not success in life, big publications. It's nothing like that. They're not even concerned about that at all. Their main concern is knowing God, and in whatever way you can speak about that. And at the same time, they pretty much unanimously agree God is unknowable and invisible, and he is elusive in that sense. One particular 13th century mystic, Meister Eckhart is his name, not at all related to the New Age guy Eckhart Tolle, but Meister Eckhart. He said, "God is in the last place you left him." And to find God, look in the last place you left him. And so he's elusive, right? In that sense, they talk about these things. They would, I think you could say that they would agree in a large part that the mystical experience is the revelation of God to the heart of man. In that way, and in that sense, salvation is a mystical experience, right? It's not a fundamentally intellectual experience, although sometimes we try and make it as such. But it's that God has been revealed to the heart of man, and everything changes when that happens. And that revealing, that would talk about that revealing as a mystery that you can only perceive, but you can't quite know or explain. And then when they write and they study and they expound, they basically tend to write about how that experience has formed them. And so I think those are some of the characteristics that we see in contemplative Christianity, mystical Christianity, what mystical theology is, what the characteristics are, how difficult it is to talk about those things. And yeah, God is in the place you last left him. Yeah, I love that one. That's a really good one. Eckhart's a bit heady to get around, but there's some certain things he says. It's like, oh man, that's good. I got to think about that. So I hope that's really helpful, just giving you things to think about on your own, and really helping you to in one way, look at the people. There's, in one sense, it's a lot of what I want to do is help to reframe charismatic culture, prophetic culture, and all that. And this part of it is these ideas of, oh well, we're the new mystics, or we're the charismatic, the prophetic prophets are the mystics, that kind of stuff. And but I want to give some really good, let's anchor this in history. Let's talk about what others have said, and if what we are seeing people say today, and I'm going to stress this over and over and over and over again, that as soon as someone starts talking, like here's the problem with prophetic and charismatic culture today as it pertains to this. Okay, I'm going to wrap up on this. As soon as someone starts talking about their experiences, and that's what constitutes the majority of their teaching, or even 50% of their teaching, immediately suspect. Because those things are those things ought to be so personal and private, it's very difficult to share them. I don't tell you what happens in behind closed doors with my wife. I never would. That's so and I'm not talking about sex, I'm talking about the things we talk about and the ways we know each other. I'm talking about the deep, personal, intimate things that we talk about and share, experience together. It is why is it okay to talk about that in the most intimate relationship you have, God, but not in the intimate relationship you have with your spouse? I think if you are going, "Well, I had this experience, God said this, God did this," all that kind of stuff, you've just exposed it's not really a relationship. It's like God people are way more interested in prostituting their relationship with God than having an intimate, hidden relationship with God because lots of people they want influence. They wanna be seen. They wanna influence people. They want the grandeur of that. And anytime you start using the experiences you have to create that, I have a significant amount of, um, you know, trepidation about going there. And again, that's because I look at the mystics in history and they don't go there. They shy away from talking about those things because the experience is so rich and profound and personal. Um, it y one, uh, uh, Therese of Lisieux, a Catholic mystic in the 1800s, she said, "Simply talking about them and exposing them to air cheapens the experience." And I totally agree with that. And we have a culture today that says, "Share about it, build a platform, let people know, teach people, and gain credibility." And it's like, as soon as that's your impetus is sharing all these things, well, teach me what God's like, not the experiences you had with him. So anyway, that's lots of thoughts for you guys to wrestle with, lots of thoughts for me to wrestle with. No, this was I love talking through this stuff, and we've got many more episodes planned. So tune in next week for our dream show, which will be going live, interpreting dreams next week. My dad and I, same time, right here at noon. And I'm going to put a couple links up here if you'd like to I've written quite a bit about these things in my articles on the Desert Fathers, which you can find at thedesertfathers.ca. So the links are all right there. Um, I've written a lot about those things actually. We have some training courses on these kind of things. We have a course called Forming the Heart, and which dives into some of this stuff, which you can find at the Wind Academy, which is a link that you'll see right there. Also, if you'd prayerfully consider supporting Wind Ministries, a monthly donation, a recurring donation, something of that nature, that would be awesome. Super helpful for what we're doing, being able to do these live streams, to publish content, to go to the places that we go. And I will put another plug up here. We have a mentorship program, personal mentorship program, my father and I, for helping you grow and develop and see the way and path forward. So you can take a look at that there, our mentorship program. So those are lots of resources for you to take a look at. Um, I hope that in a way this has challenged you to think more deeply about how you've experienced God, who He is, and who you are, and that we'd all become a bit more real in the process. And so, blessings today, and until next time.